White cop lies about black woman in court, not knowing she's a high-ranking Navy SEAL. You underestimated me, Officer Simmons, but the truth? It always finds a way. What could make a courtroom fall into stunned silence? A police officer accuses a black woman of resisting arrest and assault. His testimony? Seemingly airtight. That is, until she takes the stand, flipping the entire case on its head. But who is she? And why does her testimony leave the officer, the jury, and even the judge completely speechless? This is the story of how one lie unraveled, and how a battle for justice became a fight for truth. Let's dive in. The early morning sun peeked through the thick drapes of the courtroom, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Grand in design, yet the room felt almost suffocating. Wooden benches were packed, spectators, curious townsfolk, journalists scribbling in their notepads, and a few faces etched with quiet tension. Among them sat Monica Jackson. Her expression? Cool. Unshaken. But beneath the surface, a storm raged. Her dark brown skin glowed under the artificial lighting, her neatly braided hair resting against her shoulders. Back straight, hands gently clasped in front of her, she exuded an air of quiet confidence. Dressed in a crisp white blouse and black slacks, her outfit was deliberate. Modest, respectful, calculated. Yet her sharp eyes swept across the room, taking in every face, every movement. To the casual observer, she seemed like any other defendant. But those paying close attention could sense something different. A quiet intensity. A presence that felt out of place for someone accused of a violent crime. Then the bailiff's voice boomed. Court is now in session. Heads turned toward the front of the room as Judge Howard Grayson entered, an older white man with thinning silver hair. His air of authority was undeniable, though his face carried the exhaustion of years spent presiding over cases he'd rather forget. But this one had sparked something in him. Maybe it was the smug presence of Officer Bradley Simmons at the plaintiff's table, or perhaps it was the buzz surrounding the case, already a hot topic in the local news. The state name versus Monica Jackson, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Monica rose. Her movements? Deliberate. Controlled. The murmurs in the courtroom swelled as spectators leaned in, eager for a better view. Across the room, Officer Simmons leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence, no amusement. Dressed sharply in his police uniform, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man used to wielding unquestioned power. Monica's attorney, Benjamin Carter, a young black lawyer fresh out of law school, flipped nervously through his notes. His eyes darted to Monica, searching for some reassurance, but she didn't look back. Her gaze stayed locked on the judge, her expression unreadable. Carter inhaled sharply before rising. Your Honor, he began, his voice slightly unsteady, we are ready to proceed. The judge nodded, his sharp eyes shifting toward Simmons. Officer Simmons, take the stand. The officer stood, every movement deliberate. Theatrics. He straightened his uniform, adjusted his posture, and strolled toward the witness stand, pausing just long enough to shoot Monica a glance. His smirk? Subtle, but undeniable. A predator, certain of his prey. As Simmons took the oath, Monica watched him intently. She noticed everything. The way his fingers fidgeted slightly, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture as he sat. Details most people would miss, but not her. Not Monica Jackson. She didn't flinch, didn't move. Then, Simmons began. On the evening in question, his voice was steady. Clear. Loud enough to carry across the entire room. And just like that, the game had begun. I was responding to a disturbance call near the east side of town when I came across the defendant, Miss Jackson, loitering outside a closed business, Simmons stated, his voice steady. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Loitering. A vague charge, one often weaponized, especially against people of color. But Simmons pressed on unfazed. When I approached her and asked what she was doing there, she immediately became hostile. He continued, his tone now laced with theatrics. She refused to identify herself, raised her voice, and when I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she physically assaulted me. Gasps echoed through the room. Yet Monica remained still, unshaken. Her face, a mask of composure. Simmons shifted in his seat, putting on a pained expression. She struck me in the chest and tried to grab my service weapon. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain her. From the back of the courtroom, a woman's voice muttered, "Sounds like a lie." Heads turned, but before the moment could escalate, Judge Grayson's gavel struck down. "Order." The judge's voice remained neutral. "Thank you, Officer Simmons. You may step down." Monica's lawyer, Benjamin Carter, stood, visibly nervous. "Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to ask the court to consider." "Save it for your cross-examination, Mr. Carter," the judge cut in. "Let's move on." Monica exhaled softly. Her patience? Tested. But she didn't let it show. Instead, she leaned toward Carter, whispering, "Stay calm. Focus on the facts." Carter gave a slight nod, though the tension in his posture remained. As the prosecution rested its case, the weight in the room grew heavier. Simmons took a seat, his smirk now stretched into a full grin. From the back row, his fellow officers watched on, and Monica didn't miss the subtle wink he threw their way. "Miss Jackson," Judge Grayson called, his tone carrying a hint of skepticism. "It's your turn to testify." Monica rose, smoothing her blouse as she stepped toward the stand. The room fell silent. The weight of 100 stares pressed against her as she took her seat, adjusting the microphone with deliberate movements. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and an even sharper tongue, leaned forward. "Miss Jackson, can you explain your actions on the night in question?" Monica leaned slightly toward the microphone. Her voice, steady, measured. "I can," she replied, "but first, I need to clarify one thing." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The officer's account is not only inaccurate but intentionally misleading. A collective gasp. The prosecutor's lips curled into a smirk. "A bold accusation, Miss Jackson. Do you have proof to back it up?" Monica met his gaze, unwavering. "I believe the truth will come to light soon enough." The prosecutor opened his mouth for a quick rebuttal, but something in Monica's calm confidence stopped him. "Just for a second." Judge Grayson cleared his throat. "Proceed." And so, Monica began. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The audience leaned in, hanging on every word. This was no ordinary defendant. But what no one realized, the wheels of justice were already turning, and Officer Simmons' carefully constructed lies? They were about to unravel. Monica sat tall, unwavering. Her hands rested lightly on the wooden railing, her composure as steady as her breath. A heavy silence filled the room, waiting. Then she spoke. "On the night in question," she began, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom, "I was on my way home from visiting a friend. I stopped at the corner of Magnolia and Fifth to check my phone for directions." She paused, letting the words settle. "That's when Officer Simmons approached me." The prosecutor leaned in, ready to strike. "And you're saying this encounter was completely unprovoked?" Monica tilted her head slightly. Unshaken. "Not entirely," she admitted. "I was standing on the sidewalk, which, as far as I know, isn't illegal." Her voice was firm, but calm. He walked up, pointed his flashlight directly in my face, and asked, in a tone I wouldn't exactly call friendly, what I was doing there. "And how did you respond?" the prosecutor asked, skepticism creeping into his voice. "I told him I was checking directions," Monica replied evenly. "He asked for my identification. I asked if I had done anything wrong." The prosecutor saw his opening. "So, you questioned his authority?" Monica's response came quick, precise. "I questioned his motive," she corrected. "I wasn't obstructing traffic. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't causing a disturbance. I just wanted to know why he was asking for my ID." And with that, the courtroom shifted again. Because now, the truth was beginning to surface.